All right, diving in. Today's deep dive tackles something I'm sure a lot of you have thought about. Do Christians really need to go to church? I
Yeah.
got this excerpt from Our Daily Bread
Mm-hmm.
that digs into this, and
Yeah.
it's got some interesting stuff in it. No matter what you think about all this, I think there's something here for everyone to consider.
You're right. It's not a simple yes or no answer.
Right.
The piece lays out a good case for going to church,
Uh-huh.
but it also acknowledges those struggles folks have, even suggests other ways to approach this.
I like that they start by kind of redefining what church even means.
Oh, yeah.
It's less about the building and more about, well, the people.
Right, exactly. The source goes back to that early Greek word ecclesia.
Okay.
It means the gathering of the called.
I see.
It's all about a community of believers, which takes us back to those earliest Christians.
I always find it fascinating to read about the early church. Like,
Yeah.
you're getting a glimpse into a totally different world.
It's true, you're not wrong there. In fact, they quote Acts 2.4247 in the source,
Okay.
which describes those early Christians. They were dedicated to learning, sharing meals, praying together, and supporting each other. It was a way of life, not just a Sunday thing.
Makes you wonder what those early Christians would think
Yeah.
if they were suddenly dropped into our world today and saw how we do church now. But putting that aside for a moment, the piece then goes into those biblical reasons for gathering. They don't just stop at the Bible says so.
Right.
They get specific.
Absolutely. They use verses like Matthew 18.20,
Oh, yeah.
where Jesus says, when 2 or 3 gather in his name, he's there with them. And also Hebrews 10.2425, which talks about encouraging each other, not giving up on meeting together.
What I found interesting is they make this point. It's not just about being there, it's about what you bring to it, too. Are you really participating and encouraging others?
Right. And that ties into that idea of getting ready for the day, too. You know, referring to Judgment Day in Christian theology, a reminder to live a life that's pleasing to God.
Right.
But even beyond the theological part of it, it's about constantly trying to better yourself within the community.
So it's a two-way street. You get support, you give support. You're
Yeah.
all working towards something together.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads us to that really nice analogy they use, that the church is like a spiritual home.
Yes.
Yeah, they talk about it as this place of safety, love, and support, like home.
Right.
It's funny because for some people, their experience with church has been the exact opposite of feeling at home.
I can see that.
But I think they're tapping into something deeper here, right?
Yeah.
It's that human need to belong, but in a spiritual setting.
Right. They even quote Psalm 133.1.
Okay.
How good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. Really powerful.
It is.
That unity within a shared belief is something special.
And they don't just stay in the warm, fuzzy feelings either.
Yeah.
They go into the practical reasons why that spiritual home actually matters. You know, forming friendships,
Yeah.
getting guidance,
Right.
having people to celebrate the good times with and to lean on during the tough times. As a listener, do any of these benefits particularly stand out to you?
They all tie together.
Yeah.
You can't really have deep friendships without going through both the highs and lows together.
That's true.
And good guidance usually comes from those who really know you well.
Exactly.
And that comes from shared experiences in a community.
Totally. But Our Daily Bread doesn't pretend everyone has this rosy picture of church.
Right.
They admit that for some folks, it hasn't been that safe haven at all.
Yeah.
They acknowledge that it can be rough.
I appreciate that they acknowledge those bad experiences. Some people have been hurt, felt disillusioned, felt boxed in by all the rules. They even list some of the reasons people give for not going. Hypocrisy, disagreeing with what's being taught, or just feeling like it's not relevant to their lives anymore.
It's almost as if they're saying, hey, we hear you, we get it.
Right.
But they don't just stop there. They offer a counterpoint.
Their response comes from this idea that we're all imperfect and we need each other.
Yeah.
They use Galatians 6.2, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ.
It's that reminder that we're not supposed to go through spiritual growth alone.
Right.
Or even just, life in general. I'm curious, has anyone listening ever felt those challenges they talk about? Where church felt more like a burden than a support?
It's definitely something many people experience, and it's important to acknowledge those feelings.
Absolutely.
But then the piece shifts to another good thing about church: accountability.
Oh yeah, they say that belonging to a community can help you stay on track spiritually.
And communities of faith have always had that role throughout history.
Yeah.
They provide support for ethical behavior and spiritual practices.
I love that analogy they use from Proverbs 27.17.
Oh, yeah?
As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another.
It's a good one.
It really highlights how we influence each other, and within a religious context, that can lead to growth.
That sharpening process isn't always easy, but being uncomfortable can make real change happen. Think about it, listener. Has there ever been someone in your life, maybe in a faith community, who challenged you in a way that helped you grow?
That's a great point. But let's face it, these days, there are a ton of ways to connect with your spirituality outside of a church.
Oh, for sure.
Our Daily Bread acknowledges that, right?
Yeah, they talk about online sermons and personal study, even connecting with nature. And they don't say those things are bad.
Right.
They have value.
But there's still something special about gathering in person.
Right, exactly.
They make that distinction.
They use this analogy, watching a concert online versus being there live.
Okay.
You can still enjoy the music at home, but it's just not the same.
That's such a good analogy.
Right. It captures the feeling.
It really does.
Yeah.
But what makes that in-person aspect so important to them? Why do they think that?
It goes back to that idea from the Bible. The church as one unified body, they mention Romans 12.4-5, how we're all connected like parts of something bigger,
Okay.
like an organism.
So it's not just about your own personal faith. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself.
Exactly.
Even outside of religion, we want that. Belonging to a group, a tribe.
It's human nature.
It is.
Yeah.
What about you, listener? Where do you find that balance between your own personal practices and connecting with others who believe the same things?
That's a good question to think about. Our Daily Bread goes a step further, too. They talk about those who can't physically go to church.
Right, like when life throws those curveballs, illness, travel, or even, worldwide stuff, that changes everything.
Exactly. They suggest other options, finding online communities or starting small groups, or even just focusing on serving others locally. It's about adapting, finding ways to connect no matter what.
So it's not church or nothing. It's more like...
Right, more nuance.
Yeah. I have to say, though, one thing that makes me hesitate about this whole church as a home idea
Oh, yeah.
is that sometimes families fight.
That's true.
Even loving families disagree.
You're going to have conflict, yeah.
So how do we deal with those inevitable disagreements or clashes that come up?
Yeah.
Especially if it's supposed to be this safe and loving space, but then there's conflict. That can feel jarring.
That's where grace and forgiveness come in.
Okay.
It's not about agreeing on everything.
Yeah.
It's more about how do you handle those differences.
Sometimes we put so much pressure on finding that perfect church that matches our views completely. But maybe that's setting ourselves up to be disappointed.
Yeah.
Even the apostles who walked with Jesus argued.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to remember what the source says. The church isn't about perfect people.
Right.
It's about imperfect people trying to follow a perfect God.
That makes sense. That's a good way to look at it. So it's less about finding that perfect church and more about finding people who are willing to work through those imperfections together.
Exactly.
But what about when those imperfections cause real harm? Like, we can't just ignore abuse or bad behavior and call it grace.
Oh, you're absolutely right. There's a big difference between disagreeing about beliefs and situations where someone is being hurt. Thankfully, our Daily Bread doesn't say to just accept everything blindly.
So where's the line then? How do we know when it's something to work through versus something that's harmful and needs to change?
That's a tough one. And honestly, it's a bigger question than the source really covers. You need wisdom.
Yeah.
You need to be able to judge the situation well.
Right.
And sometimes you even need to ask for advice from someone outside the situation.
True. It's a reminder that this whole church thing isn't always simple. It's messy, like any relationship can be.
Yeah.
But deep down, it's still about that desire for connection, that longing for something bigger than just us.
And maybe that's what makes it so beautiful. Even with the mess, even with the disagreements, there's still that shared journey, that search for something more.
It's interesting. We talk about the church like it's one big thing, but really it's all these individual stories and experiences.
Absolutely. And all those different perspectives.
And those individual stories are what make it so interesting to talk about. Our Daily Bread gives us a sort of general idea, but everyone lives that out differently.
It's true. It's unique for everyone.
It's like they gave us blueprints, but we each build the house in our own way. And that brings us to something important. Their call to action.
Right.
They're not just giving information. They want the reader to do something with it.
But it's not a forceful thing, like go to church this Sunday.
Right.
More of an invitation.
Like, hey, we've told you about all this good stuff that could come from church. Now it's your turn. What do you think?
Yeah, they want you to think about what you might gain from being part of a faith community, even if your experiences haven't been great so far.
It's about being open to something new, something different. Even if you've been hurt by church in the past, it doesn't mean it can't also be a place to heal and grow.
That's powerful. Don't let the past control what's possible in the future.
It's about having the courage to hope. Believing that even when things are broken, there's still potential for good things, for connection, for something more. But before we get too caught up in these big ideas, let's get back down to earth for a minute.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the good stuff about church.
Right.
But our daily bread is honest about the downsides too.
Yeah.
They know that sometimes churches mess up.
True. They mention those times when people feel judged or like they don't belong because they don't agree with everything.
If we're encouraging people to think about church, we should also admit that not all churches are the same.
Definitely.
So as a listener, how do you even find one that's a good fit for you?
That takes some real soul searching. What are your values? What kind of community are you looking for? Are there specific things you believe that you absolutely won't compromise on?
It's like dating.
Haha, I was just thinking that.
You wouldn't marry the first person you meet, right?
Yeah.
You take your time, get to know them, see if you click. Maybe finding a church is kind of the same.
That's a good way to put it. It's about finding that place where you can be yourself, where people respect you and value you, even if you don't agree about everything. Our Daily Bread kind of touches on this.
But
they talk about finding that community that feels like home.
But home can be complicated too, can it? Families argue, they disagree, they even hurt each other sometimes.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So how does that fit with this idea of church being a place of love and acceptance?
That's why it's so important to remember what they said about grace and forgiveness.
Okay.
They're not saying you have to agree with everything, but how do you approach those differences with kindness and understanding?
Like that saying, you can disagree without being disagreeable.
Exactly.
But there are lines, of course.
Of course.
You can't just overlook harmful teachings or abuse and call it grace.
Absolutely not. And our Daily Bread doesn't say we should.
Okay, good.
You got to be able to tell the difference. If something feels wrong, if it goes against what you believe deep down, it's okay to question it, to ask for advice, or even to leave.
It's about finding that balance. Being open to different ideas, but also staying true to what you believe. And maybe that's where real growth happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to be with people who all think and believe the same things.
Right.
But does that really push us to become better?
The source hints that real growth often comes from those moments of friction, when you encounter different views, when you wrestle with hard questions.
Like that proverb we talked about, iron sharpens iron.
Exactly.
It's not always comfortable, that sharpening.
It's not.
But those are often the times we learn the most.
Maybe that's one of the best things about being part of a church community.
Yeah.
Having that space to grapple with those tough questions, to challenge what you thought you knew, to grow in your understanding of faith and of yourself. It's a journey.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, what are your takeaways, listener? Is it just a big, yes, everyone needs to go to church? Or is it something more complicated?
Our Daily Bread makes a strong case for going to church. But in the end, it's up to each person to figure out what makes sense for them.
Maybe it's about realizing that we all want connection, that sense of belonging, of something bigger than ourselves.
It's part of being human.
And maybe, just maybe, church can be one way to find that.
It's about being open to the possibility. Even if your past experiences haven't been the best, it's about understanding that church is made up of people, so it's imperfect.
Right.
But even with those imperfections, there's still that potential for good things to happen, for growth, for real community.
I like that, ending on a hopeful note. The potential, the possibility, that invitation to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep searching. So to our listeners, thanks for coming along on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope it's given you something to think about on your own journey. And until next time, keep diving deep. But our Daily Bread doesn't shy away from those downsides. They acknowledge that churches can get things wrong.
True, yeah. They mention times when people feel judged or like they don't fit in, maybe because they disagree with some of the teachings.
That makes me think, if we're encouraging people to consider church, we should also be upfront about this. Not all churches are created equal.
Right.
So how do you, as a listener, even begin to find one that feels like a good fit?
That's where a lot of it comes down to personal reflection.
Okay.
What are your values? What kind of community are you looking for? Are there certain beliefs that are really important to you, things you won't budge on?
It's almost like dating, in a way.
Uh-huh,
You
yeah.
wouldn't just marry the first person you meet, would you? You'd take your time, get to know them, see if you're compatible. Maybe finding a church is kind of similar.
I like that analogy. It's about finding a place where you can truly be yourself, where you feel respected and valued, even if you don't see eye to eye on everything. Our Daily Bread hints at this, too.
Yeah.
They emphasize that idea of finding a community that feels like home.
But even home can be complicated, right? Families have arguments, they disagree, sometimes they hurt each other. So how do we square that with this image of church as a place of love and acceptance?
That's where what they said about grace and forgiveness is so important. They're not saying everyone has to agree on everything.
Right.
It's more about how we deal with those differences.
With kindness and understanding, right?
Exactly.
Like that saying, you can disagree without being disagreeable, but obviously there are limits.
Oh, for sure.
If a church is teaching things that are harmful, or if there's abusive behavior going on, that's not something you just ignore in the name of grace.
You're absolutely right. Our Daily Bread doesn't suggest that we should. It takes discernment. If something feels off, if it goes against your conscience or your values, it's okay to question it, to get advice from someone outside the situation, or even to leave.
So it's a balancing act.
It is.
Being open to other viewpoints, but also staying true to what you believe. And maybe that's where real growth comes from.
Possibly.
Let's be honest. It's easy to be in a community where everyone thinks the same way.
Sure.
But is that really challenging us to become better people?
The source suggests that real growth often comes from friction, from encountering different views, from wrestling with difficult questions.
It's like that proverb, iron sharpens iron,
Oh,
right?
exactly.
That sharpening process can be uncomfortable.
It can.
But those are often the times when we learn the most.
Maybe that's one of the most valuable things a church community can offer.
What do you mean?
That safe space to wrestle with those tough questions, to challenge what you thought you knew, to grow in your understanding of faith and of yourself. It's a journey.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the takeaway for you, listener? Is it a simple, yes, everyone needs to go to church? Or is it more complicated than that?
Our Daily Bread definitely makes a strong argument for the benefits of church, but ultimately it's a personal decision.
Right.
What resonates with one person might not with another.
Maybe it comes down to recognizing that human need for connection, that desire for belonging, for something bigger than ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, church can be a way to fulfill those needs for some people.
It's about being open to the possibility, even if your past experiences have been difficult. It's about understanding that church, like anything with people, isn't perfect. But even within those imperfections, there's potential for beautiful things to happen, for growth, for genuine community.
I like that, ending on a hopeful note. The potential, the possibility, the invitation to explore, to question, to keep seeking.
That's what it's all about.
So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope it sparks some thoughts for you as you continue your own journey. And until next time, keep diving deep.